by putting a straight line through the relationship between land return and SPI. That is then converted to an ag use value by dividing by the cap rate. That's a very important step. So you take $100 and divide it by a 10% cap rate, you get $1,000 as the use value of that. If you take it and divide it by 5%, you get $2,000 and so on. So we take the income potential, divide it by the cap rate, and come up with an ag use value for each point on the PI scale. That number is divided by 3 to come up with this equalized assessed value as calculated. So the star is as calculated. Okay? And then this is subjected to a test for a movement from the previous year's certified EAV. And the sheets you get, generally in paper form, that have a whole bunch of blank areas, are because the area that the 10% limitation applied to has grown through time to be a really big area. So what you get out is this calculation, and it looks scarier than it is. It says the most you can get is a 10% increase, the lowest you can get is a 10% decrease, where those limits are calculated as 90% and 110% of the previous year's value. Okay? That seems like a 10% channel, doesn't it? Okay, so a very quick sidebar for all of you. Question 1 on the exam. You have $100. You lose 50%. How much do you have? Everybody has to be awake here. Let's try this all again. You have $100 and you lose 50%. How much do you now have? $50. Thank you. You have, question number 2, you have $50. Okay? You now gain 50%. How much do you have? 75. Question 3, what is the average of the rate of change from question 1 and question 2? 0. You lost 50%, you gained 50%. The average of those two rates of change is 0. Okay, so everybody with $100 in their pocket, give me 25 and you'll leave with 0 change. Okay, so at first this appears to be a very simple implementation, and it was intended as such. It wasn't meant to be applied in ways that the resulting calculations require it to be applied. So repeated application of this leads to some stuff. What you're going to see in the next couple of pictures is something that you would think, well, if all you did is calculated the smooth function across PIs, it will always be a smooth function. There shouldn't be any jumps or kinks or bends in it. Well, the problem is, if the PI below, if this channel crossed the calculation, so at some point you were limited down and at some other point you were limited up, you'll get a kink at that point where it passes through the 10% channel. Okay? So 75 and 100 both look like the same number to the process in the example I gave you. So as we were going up and got limited and we went back down and got limited, we get these sort of artifacts. Okay? The other point is that low numbers, 10% of a small number is a small number, 10% of a big number is a big number. So that's just that. So 10% of a $10 assessed value is not much. 10% of a $500 assessed value can be a really big number. And again, just to remind ourselves, and this is all done year to year, where the whole scale moves up and down because of the cap rate change. So the whole, if you're kind of doing a moving picture of this, everything is also just jumping up and down from cap rate changes, little bits, but they're relatively minor compared to changes in real interest rates and changes in real income potential. Okay, so here's what they look like when you just do the calculation for 2011. So you have really low PIs that are really stuck. Is this the calculated number? No, this is the EA star is what it should be. This is because in 1985 we had almost no income over the previous 5-year period, and you ended up with a 0, and 10% of 0 applied for a really long period of time is still 0. Okay? These kinks happen because the EAV slope isn't as steep as this general relationship. And so the point where historically we passed through the calculated function went from below to above and put some kinks in the relationship that then get carried forward. So next year we're going to start with this kinked curve and test whether or not it can go up and down again. You know, so path dependence, the history does matter. So, okay. And currently, and for some period in time, EAVs are generally above the certified levels, can create additional kind of problems through time in the relative assessment. So in counties that have really low and really high quality soils within their boundaries, you notice this more than in counties that have great ranges of PIs from 120 all the way to 124. But the taxing bodies are stuck because historically the argument was sometimes made, well, okay, so we know that this is a little low, but the rate adjusts anyhow because you put all the bills together and divide by the assessed value, and so that generates a rate. Not a problem until you hit the limitation on the extension, and then of course it's a problem for the taxing body. It's not really a question, it's just an observation. The rules are the rules at this point. But one of the questions is, remember the 10 lawyers with the 11 opinions. If you're very careful about reading the way 10% is applied, there might actually be some room to interpret 10% of what? So my suggestion is there's probably some fairly neutral ways to do this. If everything had the same 10% limit, like 10% of the middle, the top end can't go up as fast. The bottom end can kind of catch back up over a shorter period of time to its own actual point, and you don't have a statewide revenue impact of doing fairly tax neutral things like that. So, and again, just to remind ourselves also, people will often at that moment when you say something like that say, well, we have P-TEL. Well, P-TEL is a completely separate question, and the separate addressing of the rate of change of the tax rate to some relationship to something like inflation is just simply a separate idea altogether. That's applied wholly and entirely outside the assessment process for farmland. Happens in half the state, but it's just different. And likewise, woodlands is a completely different thing. So in the long run, if you had this actual red line and you took this current value and said, how long does it take to heal itself? Because 10% over a really long period of time is still a change, right? So let's go from now until 6 years from now, roughly, on the evaluation of these. Well, 10% on this scale each year up doesn't get you much movement. So we've talked to appraisers, we've talked to managers, we've talked to everybody. And probably the right ratio between an 80 to an 82 soil and a 120 to 125 soil is they sell for roughly twice as much at the high end of the scale as at the low end. The auctions in Decatur a couple weeks ago may have been a slight anomaly to that, but really close to 2 to 1. What's the rental difference in 125 soils for 80 soils? About 2 to 1. What's the yield difference? About 2 to 1. What do our calculations show? About 2 to 1. Okay? The assessed values under the certified limited process can get to ratios of 60 to 1. It's close enough for government work. Wait, are we on tape? Sorry about that. No, obviously this is just a consequence. I'm joking, but I'm not joking. This is truly a consequence of a well-intended and correctly followed set of procedures that have repeated through time. This is just where we are. Okay? So the question is it something we intend or want to change? That's a relevant one, not part of Stan's charge today. Again, this is to point out that it's simply not a calculation issue, though. If we do it, this is the slide I probably should have had showing when I talked in the last one. If you look at it from almost any angle, you find out that the 2 to 1 ratio does in fact hold pretty well. Okay, and we, Stan, you wanted some good time for questions at the end, right? I have about, is it okay if I go a while longer? Okay. I have some other stuff I just want to kind of show you to put some more context behind it before we kind of get into Q&A stuff. And the soils obviously have a pattern through the state. I probably should have presented the actual number because they're not all quite the same intervals apart. Some are a little wider in the middle. But of course, the lower valued soils and the higher valued soils, DeWitt actually does have a slight on a assessed and taxed as farmland basis, slightly different number. But these are on the farmland that's actually in the assessment data pool. So this is not the same as all the soils in the county. These are the ones assessed as farmland. And so you get some distinctions. And in areas with lots of populations, you'll see in a couple maps the fraction associated with farmland around Springfield and Champaign and Bloomington and so on. Other places with good neighbors have a lot less of the tax base in farmland. So these are the starting points, though, for the soil productivity ratings. Some of them have limitations on the rate side. The blue ones have P-TEL limits. And you can come up with an estimate. These are not real precise, by the way, and I don't want these to be, I don't want you to run back and say, gosh, my county said 17 and I know it's 14. This is a good way, though, of looking at the data in a very consistent way across all counties. We took county level assessment information in total and divided out by the acres assessed as farmland and real taxes collected on that, separated out the building parts, did all the right calculations, I believe, to come up with an average number from, this is 2010, we have 2008, 9, and 10 available. They move around a little, but generally what you see is the pattern is not as consistent in the state as you might have guessed. The lower ones are lower, higher ones are higher. The low ones are really low by a ratio of more than 2 to 1. I forgot to ask, how many superintendents of schools in the audience? So you see obviously very quickly where the questions arise and where the phone calls come based on how much is generated. And the percentage in the county of the taxes from the farmland base, again, you just knock out the slightly less rural counties out of what would have been a consistent pattern throughout elsewhere. So again, I hope just as context, this is why it's such a complicated issue across the state, is there's so many moving parts, so many differences, and the characteristics of the counties at which this is applied differ quite a bit around the state as well. Okay, so the last couple of slides just for some more things to remember. We've been doing this for a really long time in terms of keeping track of the data. And we have really long, really good farm level information. We have really good details on cash rents and on other issues related to farmland economics. And we have really good detail on farmland values, actual farmland values. So we can say is the preferential system at least proportional to what we're trying to reflect. And so the market values argument accepted in the ag use valuation idea does at least kind of track what's going on in the world. So here's a couple of series, rents on the right side, prices on the left, and these are done at an average value from USDA data, so the scale is, it always looks a bit muted relative to what you really think is going on. But the ratios are pretty good. And if you take the rent to value and just divide those two, what you get is this funny looking thing in the 80s, and the rest of it tracks really, really well. Okay? And then what if you simply divided the rent by a proxy for our cap rate? I prefer to use the 10-year CMT over the 2032A rate because I want to do it at a year-to-year basis and reflect things a little more accurately. And what you find is, you know, the farmland market actually does make some sense, and this process looks like a good idea. So I think this is, in a sense, me trying to, despite my jokes about how far the process has gotten away from actual numbers through time, recognize that the basis on which the system is built seems to work pretty well. I mean, the ideas behind it are pretty sound. There's not anything that you'd look at and go, wow, farmland just doesn't work that way anymore, or gosh, that as an approach to ag use valuation should be rejected in favor of, I don't know, ethanol basis maps or something. I don't. The point is, as a foundational approach, it's not a bad way to go. It looks to me, that was editorial, but I think the law is not a bad starting point. So what could happen? You know, anytime you have those rosy pictures and say that, you know, as an economist, it's like a lawyer, you always have the on the other hand story. Well, we also have really, really low cap rates right now. And so what you get is higher, these land return numbers that are higher generate really high answers. Cap rates, though, are really, really low, and as cap rates move up, what you get is more radical changes right now than if we were going from 10 to 11% as cap rates. You know, I can remember my first mortgage. 10 to 11% for cap rates goes from a multiplier of 10 to a multiplier of 9. Okay? That's a 1% change from 10 to 11%. If we start at 2% and go to 3%, we drop from a 50 to a 33. Okay? So the percentage sensitivity of this calculation when we start at really low interest rate levels, like we have now, is much more significant. So one of my favorite graphs, just as I want to leave you wondering if this is possibly real, this is just the yield curve every day from August of '01 till the end of the year. The dates are actually associated with little dots a little before. And so from the short end of the yield curve, so every slice, the front line of this is the yield curve at that last date. And there is actually a point to this, bear with me. So we have gone along and we've taken these average slices at about the middle of the yield curve. So the cap rate is sort of like the 5-year rolling window down the middle of this line, and it goes up and it goes down and it goes down. And right now we have a 5-year window that starts here and goes back to here. Eventually our window is going to include a lot more of that blue puddle. So we would expect, just like we got in the prices of corn and soybeans, the mortgage rate averages through time are probably also going to drop off a couple of older, bigger numbers, put on a couple of smaller future numbers, and the cap rate is probably going to continue down for a while, which will increase the multiplier for a while. So that little liquidity puddle, I refer to it, at the front end of the yield curve, it's difficult to see how to quickly get out of that situation, but it's also pretty astounding since September of 2008. So Lehman Brothers is, September 15th is the face of this cliff. The 19th is the first slip up. So since then we have had a period where it looks like new money originated is going to keep at a low point on the yield curve. So we have a lot of utilities. Just a kind of final advertisement for our group at the U of I. We do a lot of these kind of things where we have little utilities. You can drop in the soil IDs and the slope and erosion factors and calculate what the real numbers would be. And we have a bunch of other tools related to farmland stuff, if interested, generally available at our FarmDoc website. And so for the second half of the program, Brenda, I guess you're up, right? No, we're hoping for about a half-hour Q&A period. I think that's the period we've entered then. So. Thoughts, reactions?
Questions?
That clear, huh? Yes.
On the one slide earlier, you had price received for a bushel of corn. Where is the market for that slide? Where's the corn market?
It's an Illinois Average Ag Marketing Service, provides the basic stuff. We relay it on our, if you want to go to the FarmDoc website, there's also a page on that where we keep track of this and reformat it so it's easy to grab. But it is an Illinois-based prices received by farmers. So we keep track of the number of bushels also marketed each month. And so it's correctly weighted through time for that. So there's also, it's a great question because a marketing year average might make more sense for associating with crops in a particular location and PIs. We do keep track of it on a marketing year basis too. That's not how the law started being implemented, and so we didn't change midstream. If implicit in your question might be, would it make sense to go to a marketing year basis? It doesn't make a big difference.
Do you relate to Illinois Ag Statistics with part of that information too?
Do we relate to Illinois Ag Statistics? Yes. The marketing service, yes.
You had a spread on one of your slides earlier, a spread like in the 80s. What happened back then that
so
you referenced the 1980s?
Right.
Yeah.
So you can guess that there's a lot of concern by lenders and by regulators about the possibility of a farmland bubble. We know what prices have been doing the last couple of years. The Chicago survey shows last year's farmland values up 25 to 27% in Illinois, previous year 11, previous year 19, so on. So we have this enormous run up in values, and in particular the regulators are concerned, what if we had a big drop in values, okay? And so we get these questions about, are we seeing the beginning of another bubble? And if you look at land prices, you know, got a pretty good presentation on the land price stuff. You have seen this huge run up in prices. You've seen a huge commensurate run up in income. Cash rent actually hasn't kept up with the income on a share basis. And there is this question. So Sheila Bair, the chairwoman of FDIC, used the word bubble in a speech. And then Robert Schiller, an economist, used the word bubble in another speech talking about farmland. And so everybody has become very concerned about learning if that's possible, and this is one way of testing it. What happened in the 80s is you had, in some sense, lenders, I have to say, contributed to this artificial ability to run up land prices by kind of chasing asset values rather than watching cash flows. And the lending practices that led to this prior to, exports were growing rapidly, we had beans in the teens, and everything was happy and rosy. It looked like the income change was going to continue to be really high in agriculture, and then some things happened and it wasn't. Okay. What I would say that helps distinguish it from now is that the cap rate effects are not ag related this time around. They're economy wide. The short end of the yield curve, that blue puddle, if you will, on my yield curve graph is for everybody, not just for agriculture. This is very much an ag lender, at least participated in this event. Incomes changed more dramatically and reduced themselves more rapidly than they have when you're just looking at bushels of corn and soybeans. And I guess part of the point is there's just not much evidence of a bubble now. What there's evidence of is when you get these really low implied capitalization rates, really low capitalization rates by historic standards, if you get a change up in the cap rate, so if eventually the Fed has to unwind its experiment, for example, with the yield curve, and interest rates go back up, the percentage sensitivity of land price change is much greater now than it is when you start with higher cap rates. That's the main point of the slide. So, I know others may have other things to contribute about the 80s that much more profound. I'm a simple graph drawer. So. Other questions?
The law was written in 1981, correct? Which would be about the height of that peak of that curve?
Yeah, depending on the source. One of the issues is a lot of these you measure at the end of the year, the calendar year. So more, yeah, it looks like it's pushed forward about a year further than most memories would suggest.
So that would really reflect like 1979, even though it's 1981.
The peak?
Yeah.
82 and 83 actually were the starting points in different parts of the country for the decline, and 84 and 85 were the biggest reductions.
Would that curve also show the financial situation that had with the bank savings loan in 79? Is that a reflection of that as well?
To some degree, when we changed the way we thought about managing inflation, we did change the structure under the yield curve quite a bit, and we drove 21% interest rates back down pretty quickly, right? So yeah, you're correct. The lag on that process for mortgage money is much longer than it is for just what you think of as discount rate series, but that's exactly right. Also, Farm Credit had the practice of making sort of average rate loans. So put all our funding into a bucket, and the average of that cost is what we'll kind of lend it at. And then that's really attractive when rates are going up because my average will lag. And then when rates start to come back down and you're making average rate loans, it's easy for a customer to say, well, that was great when rates were going up, but now I can go to my community bank and get a 2% rate reduction. So there was a bit of a exodus from one type of lender to another kind of lender and loan at this period that kind of catapulted the market down. No, it's actually, that is an important part of the story, kind of talking through what happened on kind of monetary policy at that point. Yes?
Where is the easiest source that we can get the EAVs prior to the 10% limitation?
Brenda, you've gotten your first question. Is there a public source of the EAVs prior to the 10% limitation?
Brad might keep something like that, but I don't know. I'd have to check.
Maybe send me an email and I'll check with IDOR to see if it's releasable.
Yeah.
So, and is that a Mike level call or a?
Probably Kara.
Or Kara?
Yeah.
Okay. I think my email should have been on the last page, sherrick@illinois.edu. So, other questions? Yes.
I agree with you that the 10% limitation is flawed and that it should be investigated and looked at as far as what we can do to see how to correct this. I'm from Clay County, Illinois, supervisor assessment, and our county is very low in assessed value. And I look back at the 1999 values where we peaked at 1999, and we were like 3.3 to 1 to Champaign County, and we're at 9.91 right now. So the 10% increase has really had that detrimental effect on our county. And our county is a farm county, farm community, and we rely on farmland assessment to maintain our local township roads, and our roads are falling apart. We have no money to fix them. And the flaw in the 10% increases, I think that's the problem. And I'm just suggesting that the state take a look at the 10% rule and see if there's maybe a possibility to correct that.
Thank you. I think, you know, it's again, something I should say editorially, I agree that that's the area that is the most promising to correct this. And I think there are efforts underway to try to do that. You can guess the political climate in Springfield may not be the friendliest at the moment. And so doing anything is complicated. Doing anything right is sometimes even more complicated. And this is one to do, you know, carefully so we don't lose track of the good parts of this approach as well. So. Yes?
I'm not sure if I understood the one slide right. Of course, it's difficult to see all the data in a venue like this, but when we rolled out Bulletin 810, I thought that that was a one-time correction that brought EAVs right in line with income and everything else. Not true?
That is not true. There was some, there were some impressions that that could help get to that point. EAV is a little bit like the temperature, and 810 and 1156 are a little bit like Fahrenheit or Celsius. And so when we converted the scale, we happened to measure it while global warming was happening, perhaps, and thought we were going to catch up. But it's not really the case that the 810 adjustment changes much in the rest of the calculation. So a 125 in the 810 and a 100 in the 1156, or whatever the corresponding mapping would be, would have generated roughly the same amount of income. And the rolling forward of that difference in a period of time when the 10% didn't apply in the same way was simply that. It didn't apply in the same way. The point of reference was changed, and so that implementation was done prior to, it didn't allow a full catch-up now. So.
It skewed values so dramatically.
In some areas.
I'm in Clay County, and it really didn't bother us at all. It was minor. But I think Cumberland County was the one that had the greatest change, and it was a tremendous reduction.
So a lot of things happened at the same time in addition to 810, including the conversion from some soil associations to soil types, to corrected soil types, to acre weighted basis out of parcel weighted basis, to so it's a little bit more complicated than to say the conversion was a one-to-one item at that moment in time. It's a very complicated thing. I used to have hair, and I did a lot of this. Other questions?
Good enough.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Appreciate
you
the time.
very much.